Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. Ballots were just mailed out in the state of California this week, and so you're likely getting yours in the mail now if you haven't already. I know I got mine today. This makes tonight's discussion an important one. Disinformation is a serious topic for any citizen, but in tonight's webinar, we're going to look even deeper and discuss its impact on vulnerable populations. Did you know that older citizens over the age of 65 are disproportionately more likely to share fake news? And speaking of fake news, there's an uptick in social media being used to spread misinformation about issues like civil rights and immigration. Tonight, we'll talk about our older citizens and also think about immigrants and minority communities. We have seen the dangerous impact that occurs when disinformation campaigns target these groups. I'm Dr. Temple Northup, and I'm the director of the School of Journalism and Media Studies at San Diego State University. Our media school is bringing you this webinar to help increase media literacy. This event is co-sponsored and co-hosted by the San Diego Public Library System. Together, we both join partners with the San Diego Union-Tribune, inewsource, and the San Diego chapters for the Association of Black Journalists and Public Relations Society of America. This is the third of 5 Disinfecting Disinformation webinars this month that we'll offer. We encourage you to share your outtakes from tonight on social media. Please use our hashtag disinfectingdisinfo or tag SD Public Library and at SDSU_JMS to join in the conversation on social media. Our panel starts as a moderated conversation, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So that we can cover as many topics as possible, we're not going to spend a long time introducing each panelist. But as you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box. Our moderator today is Jennifer Bowman from inewsource. Jennifer will be leading the conversation, and she's an alumna of our media school, so I know you're in great hands. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And again, thank you. I am definitely a proud San Diego State grad, and I'm glad to be here tonight. And I'm in great company. We're going to hear more about our panelists and their expertise during our conversation, but I'm going to quickly introduce them now. Joining us is Ivy Lee, press manager at the Texas Civil Rights Project. The organization is a group of lawyers and advocates working for equality and justice in and out of the courts. It was also on the front lines of the family separation crisis at the border. We also have Lauren Mapp of the San Diego Union-Tribune. She is the paper's caregiver SD reporter, and she covers issues like senior living, elderly care, social justice, and local indigenous communities. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us tonight. So, is this true? Is this a lie? Did that really happen? Will my vote count? Are my rights at risk? What and who can I turn to for the truth? These are some of the questions we'll explore. So let's get to it. Lauren, I'm hoping you can start us off. Many of us log into social media on a daily basis, and we can be flooded with memes, false news, fake accounts. In your line of work, what types of disinformation are you seeing, and what are some of the most egregious examples?
I think prior to the pandemic, one of the biggest kind of cases of disinformation that were impacting older adults were these internet and phone scams of, people would get these calls from their from people that sounded like they were their loved ones, like their grandchildren would like frantically call saying, "Oh, we need gift cards, we need, I need money to get out of jail," or things like that. And then it would turn out that it was a scammer just, trying to find someone who will give them money in some kind of way. But as we're seeing now with the pandemic, there's been this whole shift of disinformation that's more highly focused on issues pertaining to mask wearing. We see issues with skilled nursing facilities that are now allowed indoor visitations, and they continuously tell caregivers that they can't reopen because they want to keep people safe, even though this allowed them to reopen for safe visitations. And with the visitation issue, it's really important for older adults because when a caregiver goes to visit their loved one in a nursing home, they're not just providing them with a social visit. A lot of times they're helping to make sure they're being well cared for, making sure they're being fed. a lot of times it'll even improve the way they eat and care for themselves because they know somebody that loves them is going to be there to sit and have a meal with them on a daily or weekly basis. So yeah, those are some of the kind of bigger issues. And I think just generally, I think there's something that impacts a lot of different populations is that people see a meme and they just automatically share it thinking that it's the truth when they didn't do any research into that meme to see if the quote is real, if the quote is from the person that's photographed in the picture, and to make sure that there's any kind of accuracy with it, they just share it because it's eye-catching or provocative.
Ivy, you've worked as a journalist in the past and now you work with them. What kinds of disinformation have you seen in your work? And if you could help paint the picture for us, if you could, what does this mean for citizens? What are the consequences of this disinformation?
I will say I have been, kind of in the field of public relations and, working with journalists to help them get diverse voices in their stories for, oh my gosh, I think it's like 15 years now, more than 15 years now. And I have never seen them more under attack. Reporters are dealing with just such an overwhelming amount of disinformation coming from everywhere, from all different directions, from our government, from other governments, from players, from players like within these stories, that it's just overwhelming. No, just individual person, even if they work at a big, a really big organization like CNN, Turner Broadcasting or something like that, they just don't have the resources. And now with COVID, traditionally a reporter is a kind of person who goes and verifies, with their own eyes and ears and instruments and cameras and everything. And now with COVID, they can't even do that. So it's becoming, it's definitely not a job that I would want right now. I'm as stressful as working at the Texas Civil Rights Project is. I'm glad I'm not a working journalist right now, and I feel for y'all. I feel for y'all so much. I think the danger that we're in is it's not. It used to be kind of we hear a lot about extremism. And that's certainly a danger, right? Extremism is certainly a danger for any democracy where we're supposed to try to have, majority rules and minority rights, and a government of consensus. But what's actually happening now is it's not merely the right and the left like it just used to be, where people would just argue and it was stressful. The times that now we look back with nostalgia, that we think were simpler times, but at the time we thought they were really difficult times. What we're seeing now is that it doesn't matter if you're right or left, that there is just a general distrust, that there's an awareness that there's so much disinformation around that now, we can't even engage. If you don't have what you believe are facts, you can't even begin a national conversation. You can't even engage in a real substantive discourse with heated disagreement. You just are kind of inhabiting different realities from your fellow countrymen. And that really undermines the social agreements that not only keep our democracy alive, but kind of keep our whole societies kind of alive. Almost everything about how you construct your life is a social agreement that we just all decided to make up in our heads at the same time and agreed to that. Like this object, which now they're not even objects, like this object is money. Right? We have to all agree what money is, and we have to all agree to to value this so that we can exchange it for goods. And if we just all decide that we don't agree on that, then our entire economy, right, our entire basis of our economy kind of collapses. So all of these things, like what is a crime versus what is a civil, suit. There are all these things that are just our social agreements that make up our reality. And without some way for us to agree on shared facts, like all of that starts to come undone. There's a saying, I think it's some old timey politician that said it. It's like, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts, right? And wow, how prescient was that? Now we're getting to the point where we're like, wow, like I'm not even sure if my facts are facts sometimes, So yeah, I think that's I think the danger, the level of danger that we're in. That's what a society that is plagued by disinformation, that's what that looks like.
And I think there's also the issue of, distorting truth from what would typically be seen as trusted sources, like the government, right? You've seen, this is something that the Texas Civil Rights Project has seen firsthand. I'm wondering if you can talk about your group's recent case regarding immigrant expulsions.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, so at Texas Civil Rights Project, we have 3 programs: criminal and justice reform, voting rights, and border and immigrant justice. And we're actually experiencing this kind of purposeful government disinformation in all of our programs. But maybe one of the most egregious is this thing about immigrants and immigrant expulsions. So expulsions are not a legal process, they're an extra legal process. What you would probably know as a traditional legal process would be like a deportation process, where you actually have to have like records, and a process and due process. There's like an established process for officially deporting somebody. An expulsion is what they're calling it when there is just no process. Well, they will literally just drop them somewhere random on just anywhere but here, right? And if it's a place, if they want to place them somewhere that's not contiguous to the United States, they have to hide them somewhere so that no one knows that they exist, or else they have to be, we are a country of laws and due process. Like traditionally, that's what we are. But there has been this process called expulsions, which the justification is that there's a CDC order that says that we have to do this. But the CDC making immigration law it's not a thing. It's not a thing that happens. They don't make immigration laws. But that's the justification, to turn people away. And this is how ridiculous this justification is. The justification is we can't let people with COVID come in. But in order to expel them, because we're expelling people to countries that do not have the health resources, the public health resources to deal with a COVID outbreak in their country, we have to COVID test them for the country that we're trying to send them to take them back. And we only send them once they are clear and they obviously don't have COVID. And then we're testing these people and we know that they don't have COVID, but we're expelling them so they don't bring COVID to the United States. Like, that's how absurd this idea is. Well, we had clients, every single person that has come out of this secret underground off the book system has a crazy story of how we even came to them. And I can't even tell you those stories because it would endanger the lives of these people. But earlier this year, a little girl told us that she, after she had been chased into a river by dogs, by Customs and Border Patrol, so she was injured, and so she went to a hospital. And she said that after she left the hospital, she was in a hotel, and we were like, that doesn't sound right. Like, are you sure you're in a hotel? And she described what is obviously a hotel, and we're like, that's not a thing. That's not a thing. How could that be? How could that be? But she swears that that's what happened to her. And so we were starting to become suspicious. Well, we eventually figured out where the hotel was that she had been held, and it was still being used to do this. So these hotels, there's no paper trail whatsoever. There's no RFP, there's no government RFP procurement system, which is the normal process to hire a government contractor. None of that exists. It's a private security company that books these block of rooms like it's just the most messed up team building exercise like ever, right? And they detain all these people. Just to give you some reference, when people are detained in detention centers, they have to have access to a phone by law, because sexual assault by guards on detainees is such a pandemic thing, such a serious and widespread thing in these places that that inmates have to have access to a phone. Well, they took the phones from all of these people in the hotel, so there's no phones that are accessible in hotels. We know that because we tried to get a client's name. For us to represent somebody, we have to have a name, a date of birth, and a country of origin. So we went to the hotel, and of course, and we actually got into a viral fight with them. Like they physically, shoved our attorneys out of the building, these security contractors. So then we tried to get our phone number through the windows of the hotel, and people held up signs that they scrawled in like a pen that said, "We don't have phones. There's no phones in here. We can't use phones." So we filed a lawsuit on behalf of these people. We couldn't get a name, but we did this thing called we're like next friend, where like the next, almost like the next closest relative on behalf of somebody, because they can't, for whatever, in this case, a very obvious reason why they can't file. Well, when we filed our lawsuit, they said, okay, we're gonna put everybody that was in the hotel at the time that you filed, at the hotel. We were like, no, everybody on that Thursday when we tried to get a phone number, or try to get a client out, and they're like, no, yeah, sure, yeah. So we filed on Friday. We went on Thursday. We filed on Friday. At 2 a.m. on Thursday morning, they had expelled everyone, or they said they had expelled. They did not admit, but they had expelled all but one of the unaccompanied children. But they said, yeah, we're gonna give you back all of the unaccompanied children. But it was only one left. We were able to get some of the families. We had to prod because we were like, we took pictures. We saw families. We saw adults with babies in diapers in the windows. You got to cough up these families. You got to tell us how many families are there. You got to cough up these people, And so there was only one child. And we got Congress members to kind of, to press on this, because they didn't know what was going on. No one knew what was going on. The Office of Refugee Resettlement said there are no unaccompanied children. Nothing has been reported to us. As far as anybody knew, these people did not exist. If we lost, we probably have lost many. We don't know that they exist. And when Congress people pressed and said, obviously this is happening, tell us how many people, they said there have been no unaccompanied alien children, because unaccompanied alien children fall under a different set of laws. Children just generally have an extra set of laws that you have to follow. And they said, well, tell us how many people. And they said, well, it's been 7,000 single minors. Tell me, everybody here speaking English, what's the difference between an unaccompanied child and a single minor, right? But that's how they had the numbers, is they just decided to make up a new phrase for the same thing and say that the unaccompanied children do not exist. That's why we didn't report them to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. But here's several thousand single children. That's the level. That's the level of disinformation and dishonesty and pushback that we're having to do. And every single time we file a lawsuit, we're able to just get like one tiny little extra bit of information out.
So I wonder how many people have seen that story come across their sources of news, right? And so much disinformation and how to fight it comes from people's own news diets. Some rely on what happens to come through their feeds. Some may have their favorite news sources and they don't go further, or some people may seek only things that confirm what they already believe. Lauren, I think anyone and everyone can fall victim to disinformation, but the elderly, a primary group of your audience, can be particularly vulnerable. I'm wondering if you can talk about that a bit more. So what are some of the traps, and do you have any tips on how to spot them?
The main way that people fall into these webs of disinformation is not diversifying their news sources. I, for example, follow newsrooms from all walks of life in my social media profile, so I can see not only ones that confirm my ideas, but maybe ones that challenge my personally held ideas as well. And I think that one of the big traps is this trap that I was kind of mentioning before of sharing memes, not news stories. I think the more that those get shared, those don't get fact checked. There's not journalists producing those there, and so people are seeing these things come across there and sharing them because someone they trust shared it, and so there can be potentially have issues there as well. And then there's a lot of kind of fear tactics that people use with disinformation campaigns, trying to scare people into believing that something is true. And I think the way to fight against this disinformation is to increase media literacy and be able to fact check things yourself just by running a simple Google check, which I know we'll go into a little bit later as well. But yeah, if something seems too wild to be true or too good to be true, I always Google anything that I see on social media because I know that there's a very strong case that it might not be exactly factual, and I try to find more than one source that can confirm that.
Ivy, I hear your story about what the situation you just described, and I go, man, it'd be great to have a law degree, right? To spot disinformation or this widespread knowledge of the responsibilities of agencies. I don't know if there's any practical tips you have when this disinformation has such dire results and consequences, but if you've got any, feel free to share with us.
Sure. Yeah, it's actually, the lawyers are having a lot of trouble. the lawyers are having a hard time too. Everybody's having a hard time. It's harder than it ever was. I think to start, if you see something that feels like I'm not sure about this, Google the outlet, not just Google, but find the Wikipedia article about the outlet itself. I have accidentally scheduled an interview for one of my colleagues with a Russian-backed, you know what I'm saying, like with a Russian-backed outlet, but luckily we got it on Wikipedia in time to cancel the interview, and yeah, so it's hard for everybody. I would Wikipedia that. I also work on your algorithms. That the news feeds tell you what you tell the platforms that you want to see, right? So the things that tend to be fake news or tend to be made to be incendiary, don't click on them. Just scroll past them, or to start to people who are sharing those things, like start to hide their feeds, or you can say, you know, hide news from this website. And then you can also go and interact more with articles from sites that you find that you trust, that you find more trustworthy. For example, there's actually this really common chart. I don't know if I can message it to you guys. I can't be honest, but it's a California League of Women Voters article about how reliable is your news source, and there's like a chart that kind of lets you know like which ones tend to be, you know, tend to be more neutral and which ones tend to take a side or have some outside influence or something like that. I would also look for, there are just really great, for example, The Root. The Root is something that I have been going to more and more and more for news, especially of domestic issues. They are just some of the best Black journalists in the country write for The Root. And I think there's this idea of, oh, well, you know, if you're a person of color, you're not neutral. Well, you know, if you're not a person of color, you're not neutral either, right? Everybody has a stake. Everybody has a stake in the future of our country. Everybody has a lived experience that colors how they, you know, change things, that colors how they interpret something. Everybody has a place in society and an experience that informs how they decide what facts are relevant and what facts aren't, and in what order that they're relevant. So having an experience, you know, having kind of a place like The Root to go. The Root is mostly Black journalists, to kind of understand, you know, to just like seek out, well, what does like, if you see it as not neutral, then you say, okay, here's a predominantly, you know, a white outlet, like what's their interpretation? Well, let me go see like what predominantly Black outlet, how they're covering the same event, and then try to, you know, and they're going to give you different facts, and then you can try to sort those out for yourself. It requires a lot of work. But I think the stakes are high enough that it's worth it for everybody to do their part to, you know, keep our democracy together. And another thing I do is I look for people on the front lines of the issues that we know about. So, for example, the reason why we found out about the hotels was because we talked to somebody who had been detained in one. That's how we found out about it. No one was going to tell us, right? And only because somebody who actually experienced it did we ever find out. And only because we found that out did any journalist ever even know that was going to be a thing. The whole issue with the family separation at the borders, that was completely, even when we saw it with our own eyes, we didn't believe it. It just did not seem possible, right? It just not like, we must be misinterpreting this, right? It did not seem possible. But the thing that you just did not think was possible, it was happening right before our eyes. It was so hard to believe it, even with our own eyes. So, you know, if people are saying that you have reason to believe that they're on the front line and they're experiencing firsthand right now, I think that's the only the problem and the antidote. The problem is these algorithms, but the kind of the good part about these algorithms is on these social media sites is that you do have access to people. With everybody's got a camera in their pocket, and that you probably are going to be able to find somebody who was actually there and get in just with their own eyes what they saw.
And I'd like to add on to what Ivy said about kind of redeveloping your algorithm. You can also, if you find something that is unfactual on social media, you can report it and potentially have it removed from social media so that other people aren't falling into that same trap. I also added in a link in the chat for media bias and fact checking website, and that's usually my go-to to see if I see a news story, alleged news story being posted. You can see where they fall as far as media bias, as far as liberal or conservative, but you can also see how factual their reporting is.
Perfect. I want to pivot a bit to trust in news media because we all know it can go hand in hand with the spread of disinformation. There's certainly efforts, and they're well documented to, efforts to sow distrust, to discredit the truth when it's being reported. But we know that we in the news don't always get it right. And a survey by the Pew Research Center found 44% of Americans believe a desire to mislead the public is a major factor behind significant mistakes in news stories. But there's also a nugget of good news in that Pew report. 75% of US adults say it's possible to improve the level of confidence Americans have in news media. So there's some hope. But Lauren, as a reporter, where do you see room for improvement from news organizations when it comes to building public confidence? And tell me, do you think those efforts would help in the fight against disinformation? What's your level of optimism there?
Yeah, so it's definitely interesting, hearing that fact and, that people think that there's this group of journalists that are purposefully trying to get things wrong. I think that the big thing that media needs to really be doing is making sure that they have more weight towards putting out truthful information and taking their time, even if they don't necessarily break the story. I know a lot of good news organizations, they really do, take the time to fact check before they, put something out. They don't just jump to putting something out so they can have it out first. I think it's also really important that newsrooms are vocal about the decisions that they make, both from the business perspective and from the reporting perspective. I know a lot of reporters will kind of document their reporting process as they're working on a story in a way to show themselves going out in the field and doing their interviews and, discussing the details of how they got those interviews and what their takeaways were on social media, things that wouldn't necessarily fit into a typical news article, but it gives more light and more clarity to what the news reporting process is. And I think by showing that to audiences, they can see how much work is going into it, that, throwing together facts, just to try to drive up numbers. People do really care about their job, and, you don't go into the news business, which is a relatively unstable business, because you don't like it. People love to report and get the facts out. And so I think showing that passion, either through social media or through writing, personal narrative stories every so often, really helps to build up more trust in the media.
Yeah, I don't think reporters enter the news business to become millionaires. We know this.
Certainly not.
Ivy, what about you? What do you see as the challenges to news media building that public trust, and what do you think the news media can do about it?
I think it depends on what segments of the public we're talking about, because I think part of the problem is that we're not just one public, anymore. We're many severed publics living in our own world, and that we're not able to access each other because of kind of these information prisons that our algorithms have built for us. But I think media
does need to acknowledge that media is a power structure. I mean, we literally call it the fourth leg of democracy, right? So media is just as responsible as the judicial system, as the executive branch, and as our legislative branch for creating the structures of power and these kind of cultural agreements that are leading to, that are kind of easy to pick on, right, by other by say foreign powers, like these little divisions that are like easy to pick on, that all four of these bits of democracy are part of that. So certainly one thing that I advocate for all the time is diversifying newsrooms, of making sure that there's more kinds of people from more parts of, from more parts of America, from different, people who have not historically had access to these newsrooms to tell their stories. In the case of the hotels, I challenged a lot of reporters. They wanted everybody, no one wanted to tell a story without interviewing somebody who had been expelled, who had experienced the system themselves. But a lot of times, first of all, the whole point of everything about zero tolerance, from the family separation to the migrant protection protocols, which is basically a homeless encampment in the most dangerous place in the world for journalists, right? So that it's just a couple miles down the road where family separation took place, but now cameras can't go there, to expulsions, where like, no, these people don't even have what is called an A number. An A number is kind of the tracking number for you when you're like, all right, here's your application, here's your court date, here's your A number, and that's just kind of what your number is in the system as they put you through the process. These people don't have A numbers. They're almost impossible to get out of this like black box of information. But no reporter wanted to write about it without a person. And I'm like, don't you understand? They're trying to disappear. The story is that these people are being disappeared. How am I supposed to give you somebody who is in the process of being disappeared? You have, and they're like, well, we don't want to tell the story. We can't tell the story without it. I'm like, you have to find a way, first of all, to tell the story. And that's how the hotels like thing came about. And not only do you have to find a way to tell the story with, I want you to take these tactics and this new way of thinking and innovating in order to handle the threat of government misinformation now. And I want you to take that into the future, because even when things go back to normal was exploiting the trauma of certain communities for profit. When we had people call us after family separation, not trying to help reunite the families, but wanting to adopt the poor little children, the poor little foreign children. They wanted to adopt them. And you know what? Some of those kids did get adopted, and some of those parents were never able to get their own children back that were forcibly taken from them. That is still happening. We've been making hundreds of phone calls trying to get status updates on these people and who's been reunited and not. Some of them are not reunited, and some of them is because those children have been adopted by American families. So we tell these stories, like the reporters want to do a good thing, right? I don't think anybody signs up for any kind of public service, whether you're signing up for the military, or you're running for office, right? Or you're gonna go like not make that much money, right? In media, everybody wants to go in doing a good thing, but your good intention does not equal a good impact. So there's that, right? Like diversifying and not tokenizing people in your newsroom, like finding, like forcing yourselves to think of new ways to tell stories and meet these challenges, instead of just being like, right, this is too many lies and all the resources. Like, you just have to find a different way. Everybody else has to adapt, and the newsrooms has to adapt too. And I think it's not usually the reporter's fault. It's usually somebody else. It's usually an editor, but the headline problem, right? The person who writes the headlines, that's a tip I would have for consumers of media. If a headline is like, I don't know, or a headline is like, oh, I agree with that so much, don't click share before you actually read the article, because the story and the headline can be very different experiences. And I think that in a newsroom, there's a power differential. A lot of times the person writing the headline has formal power as like a boss or a supervisor or something of the reporter. And I don't know what newsrooms have to do to take collective action or whatever, but these people writing the headlines there needs to be something done about this. Like, we can't just say, okay, this is what the algorithms want, this is we're gonna write for them. At some point you have to say, all right, what is it that what is my responsibility as a headline writer when I work in the fourth leg of democracy?
That's great.
With the headlines, sometimes those headlines get written after you're already done with your day as a reporter. You know, the headline writer goes in and is like, oh, this is what I think the story's about. And then the next day I read it in the paper. I'm like, that's really misleading, the way that you wrote this headline based on what the story is. And I think that just needs to be like an ongoing conversation that journalists have within their newsroom, that they want to have, you know, final approval of whatever the headline is, regardless of.
I lost Lauren's audio.
I think so. I think she's frozen. We'll see if she comes back. Although she was saying great stuff. So I'm going to jump to another question, but if you've got some questions, if you're out in the audience, feel free to go ahead and add that to the Q&A box or the chat box. I'll keep my eye on those, but oh, Lauren, you're back. Hello. Okay. So I'll start, let's jump to this question. This was discussed in the first session of this webinar, and I thought it really sparked a really good conversation. And the first session talked about empowering individuals to tell their own stories, that disinformation can happen because other voices aren't being heard. And I think y'all touched on that a little bit about the lack of representation in the room and who's being represented in those newsrooms. That Pew report, I clearly love that Pew report. They had yet another interesting finding. Black Americans are more likely to pick their news sources based on whether they see themselves in coverage. 68% of Black Americans said this. This is compared to 41% of white Americans. And that's just one example of the many feelings that Black people and people of color hold when it comes to the news. But I'm wondering if we can hear your thoughts on this. How do you see diversity and inclusion of voices fitting into the conversation of fighting disinformation? And whoever wants to jump on that first, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so very, very vital to have representation in all aspects of society, whether it's government or the military or policing or the newsroom. And a lot of times, here in San Diego, I will be out, trying to cover stories of communities that have typically been underserved by media outlets in the past. And when they find out where I work, they say, oh, well, I don't subscribe there because that paper doesn't serve me. Or because they're judging the current newspaper staff by things that happened years ago, whether it's the way that redlining was covered in the past, or different policies that negatively impacted communities of color. And so, people want to know that their story is being fairly told, but to be able to tell it fairly, you also have to be able to build trust with these communities. And they need to be able to trust you with your story, with their story, that you're going to write it in a fair way, that you're not going to misquote them, that you're not going to spin their quote to fit whatever preconceived idea that you had already. And I think when the public knows that the news outlet wants their demographic, they're a little bit more trusting, because there might be some kind of shared experience, whether it's a language issue or a cultural issue, or because the reporters from the same racial demographic, it really helps to feel like there's some kind of common ground before you even start to tell the story. And I think newsrooms are getting a lot better. I know our newsroom especially has been getting a lot better at not only hiring diverse reporters to tell stories for our newspaper, but also reaching out to the community to talk about big picture issues like the social justice movement. we've had series after series of personal narrative stories from community members talking about what it's like to be Black in America, to be Black in San Diego. And this has been, all summer, this huge push to make sure that people are being able to tell their story the way they want to tell it.
I definitely agree. I agree that newsrooms are trying, but they're diversifying from the bottom up. And being a diverse person in an organization that is not yet inclusive is very difficult, right? But it doesn't, but having people in your newsroom who are tokenized does not necessarily result in the impact, right, that is necessary. An example that I have that was one of the worst crisis communications issues I've ever had to deal with in my life was when ProPublica, a very highly regarded watchdog like news organization that does kind of deep investigative reports to uncover and keep the government accountable, like playing their role with a lot of super smart people. I mean, Pulitzer Prize, I mean, every kind of prize you can think of, like they've got, you know, they published a video that essentially a snuff film. It was a video that they got of a client of ours, a child who was 16 years old, dying in custody. That they did not show the family first, and the family did not agree. And it's public property, right? They got a one of those Freedom of Information Act requests. It was like the jail's video, the jail surveillance video they got. So it wasn't theirs. It wasn't their work product. It was public property. That's how they got it. But I've never worked with a reporter before, and I told the publisher. We got on a conference call, and they had their entire leadership team was on that conference call, and I do mean a white male publisher, a white male, like the head editor, a white male senior counsel, and the white female editor who was the editor over that specific story, who made those decisions on that specific story. And that, and I get calls from ProPublica all the time. We didn't blacklist him or anything because we took him to task about it. And we started an entire conversation in all of immigration journalism about how people profit off, like how they are portraying the trauma of Black and brown bodies in a very different way than they would if the people dying were white. For example, right, you do not see pictures of all of these dying COVID patients in Italy, right, or New York or wherever. There are literally reporters whose like the category of issues that they have to cover is mass shootings and school shootings, and you do not see the pictures of those dying children, right? But these dying children, you can literally broadcast, right, their dying moments without showing the family, which, by the way, the family really needed that video for their case, by the way. Right. So there was, like, I mean, levels of impact to consider here. And there are people of color in that newsroom, and they were very angry about it. And they are still very angry about it. They always let me know if they call. They're like, hey, I know I'm asking you for this interview. I just want you to know I was here or I was not here when that happened with your organization. And I want you to know that we still talk about it. And I want you to know that I'm one of the people of color here. And I, definitely disagree with the decision. They like kind of feel like they have to explain, which good. They should feel like they have to explain to me why we should let them talk to another one of our clients. Absolutely, they should have to, because we have to protect our clients, our clients who have already experienced so much violence, you often by the state, that we're not going to just like hand them over to kind of experience this in another power structure. So yeah, they should feel that they have to explain that. But usually part of that explanation is they did not, as even when they were in the newsroom, no one consulted them. Nobody in leadership consulted them. And even when they issued an apology, the editor wrote an apology. It was the most raceless apology. They never acknowledged the race aspect to this, nor even the cultural, the kind of like they said, they explained it, what they were going to do to the parents. And I'm like, did you really not only translate across language, but across culture to his parents who live in the mountains in rural Guatemala, the most food insecure country in Latin America? Did you really explain to them what was about to happen to their lives when ProPublica published a video of their son's death? I don't think you did, right? I don't think that they did, but they did not address that in that letter either. So yes, like, we're diversifying, but it is still like, look at us, we have people of color, but the decisions are still being made the way that they have always been made in a lot of these newsrooms. I feel like I'm just getting so worked up about Carlos's case that I don't even remember anymore what the original question was.
No, that was good. I mean, we were talking about, what are the challenges to news media building public trust and what can be done about it. And I think you highlight a major issue when we talk about representation in the newsroom, and in what areas are we representing, right? And I think this has always been a long-standing issue in journalism, one that I think journalism has been unwilling to confront directly, but very open to reporting on the shortfalls of other organizations and other institutions. And just now, I think we're seeing a real rise and a real focus around that. And it'll be interesting to see if that.
I actually just got an email today, and I was super supportive of it. That said, hey, totally optional. We've already published this story, but you know, a person from Texas Civil Rights Project was quoted in the story. Would you mind sharing with us the person's like ethnicity, gender, and age? Because we're trying to keep track of, they're trying to measure the problem of like how disproportionate, how representative of the community are of the state. It was a Texas as a statewide media organization. So they're like, we're trying to see like, are they unfairly kind of picking certain voices like over others? And this is the first year that they're doing it. And so they go back, that's what they're doing. They go back after the story and ask if they can have the demographic information. It's totally optional if you don't want to do it, but if they do that, they're gonna keep tabs and they're gonna report on themselves at the end of the year. And I was like, yeah, sure. We completely support that. We'll totally send you all the demographic information that you want.
So I know we have a couple questions here. Donna Stewart had one. Any recommendations on how to encourage an older person kind of set in their ways to explore other sources?
I mean, this is a conversation I have with my grandmother quite often, because she's one of, you know, I love her, but she will sometimes post things just because she sees them and she thinks it's true. I think the kind of main point is to not try to belittle someone because they're sharing false information or disinformation, to just really try to engage and have a genuine conversation about, you know, where the information is coming from, where how you can check it, and kind of go through the steps of questioning, you know, at least thinking and critically thinking and questioning the information you see, not just believing it as value. I think that's kind of an important step. So just really engaging with someone instead of attacking them.
I see this question in the chat that I didn't know if you were ready to get to, but I would like to address it if possible.
Sure. Are we looking for one from Chris?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think that came in during our discussion about, we were talking about ProPublica. Just for the audience, how does this apply to understanding, well, not just about ProPublica, but talking about representation in newsrooms. How does this apply to understanding how to disinfect the disinformation being passed off as news?
I think yeah. So I think the reason why I am trying to explain how kind of how the sausage is made, right, is to just kind of give you a sense of give you a kind of a cross section of all the different kinds of unconscious biases, because I want to give, you know, most journalists are trying to be honest and trying to do their best with limited resources to overcome an overwhelming amount of lies, just physically overwhelming. So some of those lies are going to come through because there's just not as a society, we're not a society that that is geared to distrusting everything, right? And we just don't have the resources to when we're talking about the scale of lies that I am dealing with. Most organizations are just not going to have the resources to combat that every single day. We don't even have the resources. People were trying to fact check during the debates, and it's like they're just going so fast and there's just so much going on, and sometimes so many different little factoids are in one sentence, that the speed of information that is now, it used to be, oh, they'd have all night to fact check and then they print it in the morning like a comprehensive thing, but now we're having to, if you don't fact check it in real time, no one is ever going to get, like a day later it will be too late, no one will get that information. So it's just kind of a physical impossibility. But I think it's important to know how the sausage is made so that you can kind of back up and also kind of help with the fact checking and back up to be like, okay, what facts are not being told, whose stories are not being told and why, whose stories are being, whose voices are consistently being used and why, and how does that kind of distort my understanding of what's going on in the big picture. You're right, there's no foolproof way for every single fact, but I think when you can kind of look at critically and say, all right, whose point of view is being represented and why, and how long, and what would it take to change those things, and is this news source one that's doing these things to proactively try to come closer to reality. I think that's I hope that's helpful information.
Great. So we've got a question from Crystal. And it goes back to Ivy, I think when we were talking about headlines and who writes them. Headlines are usually written by editors and copy editors. Many newspapers have design hubs or studios. So the local journalist does not have control over the headline and layout. Sometimes those design hubs, I know from personal experience, can be in a completely different state. What can we do to localize stories when these news conglomerates have changed the way the story is published? And she also had a follow-up question that I think really goes hand in hand with the first. As newspapers die off and large companies take over most local newspapers and the stories they tell, and we're talking Gannett, Media News Group, how do we hold them accountable?
I think as a news reader or a consumer of the news, it's important to support your small local newsrooms. If those small local newsrooms aren't being supported either through subscriptions or donations for nonprofit news, then that's how they kind of get bought up and kind of together in these big companies that really cover more national issues. I think as a reporter, it's important to have direct conversations with managers or with headline writers to make sure that it's more of a collaborative process and it's not just a clickbaity kind of headline, that the headline actually is going to reflect what the story is about.
Have you guys seen this story in Current Affairs? It's called, it's actually is it behind a paywall? It's called The Truth is Paywalled, but the Lies Are Free. Do you know what I'm talking about? I don't know if I can get it to you guys. Crystal, I'm gonna send it to you because I feel like you're the one who's sharing all of these. Okay. So I think Lauren touched on this, is there are nonprofit newsrooms. So the problem you're talking about is the commoditization of news. So profit-driven journalism. Profit-driven journalist outlets are the worst about the headlines. They're the worst about the headlines because their incentive is not to get it right every time. Like, that's not the metric for success. The metric for success is how many eyeballs did you get on the ads and how much money are your shareholders getting back. If you aren't paying for something, you are the product. And that is more true now in the age of the internet than ever. If you are not paying for your news, you are not the consumer. You are the product that website is selling. So pay for your news. There's that article. I hate that this is the truth, that the truth is paywall, but the lies are free. I hate that that's the case, but the only way kind of on an individual level is to pay for news at reputable sources. There are also nonprofit, yeah, absolutely. There are nonprofit news organizations. I've personally, like outside of work, I donate. I am an annual giver to, in my state, it's called the Texas Tribune. They're a statewide, they kind of like hold the state government, accountable. They're like the nonprofit news organization to do that, that aren't owned by Gannett or anything, which Gannett is huge in my area. So yeah, that's that. From an individual level, I think that's all you can do. From our level where we work, you guys agitate in newsrooms. I yell at editors. I yell at editors who, kind of aren't living to these ethical standards, like, all the time, right? Like, that's just a part of my day-to-day work, is holding people accountable, holding people in power accountable. But as an individual, like, I think that's what you can do. But, I bet if you bugged your publishers and wrote them, you could agitate for disinfecting the disinformation as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Ivy and Lauren, for this talk and for letting us pick your brains today. I think we had a really good wide-ranging discussion that kind of shows that disinformation has many many tentacles, if you will, to it. So it looks like our time together is wrapping up, coming to an end. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kay Sweetser to wrap things up.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And thank you to everybody here who's on the webinar tonight, listening to the conversation between Lauren and Ivy. Disinformation is even more dangerous when we think of it with regard to our vulnerable populations, like older citizens or immigrants. And tonight's topic really started to get into that. In this series, in examining disinformation, it's become very evident that our ability to spot disinformation is crucial to actually stopping disinformation. If you missed part of the webinar today, or you just want to watch it again, we're going to send out the playback video tomorrow, and so you'll be able to relive all of this fun. Our next Disinfecting Disinformation webinar is going to be a week from tonight at 6:30 Pacific time, same place, 1 week later. And that webinar is going to focus on social media. So we did start to talk a little bit about social media and algorithms, and we're going to have a bunch of experts in SEO as well as digital journalism who are going to come in and break it all down for you. The registration link for that is in the chat box now if you want to go ahead and get your seat now. We do hope that you will join us for that. In leaving, I really ask that you please tell us what you thought about the webinar today. After all, we are a school that is based in continual improvement. So when you get a survey about this webinar, please fill it out. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great evening. And don't forget to fill out your ballot and mail it in, drop it off, or go vote. Thanks.